It's a particularly big problem among African-American youth. Homicide, in fact, as you may know, and if you don't, it is the leading cause of death. So what can we do to curb the violence in an environment where the educational infrastructure is crumbling in our cities and the jobless rate continues to spiral higher as we perpetuate all sorts of outdated systems that trap money that could otherwise be used for our children and our country? Cliff Kelly, you just saw there, popular Chicago radio talk show host and former city alderman, has been a vocal activist about that city's problems. Jonathan Capehart remains here. Cliff, to what do you attribute the violence?
Well, there's a number of reasons for the violence, of course. There is the situation where we don't have after-school activities for young people, such as we used to have, where the young men and women would go out and do various things after they got out of school. That doesn't happen to the degree that it used to. But the irony here is that this horrible beating that has been international, the killing of this young man, has nothing to do with the teen violence that we have seen in the past. The reason for this, and it's an irony that also that the Secretary of Education would come in here, because, as some people suggest, he is the reason that this sort of thing has happened. You have taken children out of one area and sent them to another school where the school that they used to go to, they can't even get into. So they've been sent to another neighborhood. And of course, it's been for years where people couldn't go in certain neighborhoods. The mayor certainly knows that. You couldn't go in Bridgeport, otherwise you'd really get beaten down. So these young people from one area were forced to go to schools in another area, and that is the reason for this situation at Finger. They left their own area and came to Finger. The young people at Finger didn't want them coming into their area, and that's something that we see everywhere. I mean, this isn't anything new. But it was created by Duncan when he was here. He is the one who came up with this Renaissance 2010 plan, as they call it, and they were warned about this. They were told this is going to cause problems. Now, in some areas, you have to cross gang boundaries. But it doesn't have to be gangs. It could simply be the fact that you're in a neighborhood where people don't want you.
Jonathan Capehart?
Yeah. I mean, it's very disturbing to hear what Cliff has to say. I mean, maybe I'm being too idealistic or utopian here, but the idea that children in the United States not being able to go to school because they have to cross some unseen boundary, or because of traditions, if you want to call it that, is really unsettling. But Cliff, there's a question I want to ask you, and it's something that NBC's Sure. John Yang said in a report earlier this morning, and he said that perhaps it's because of the Hope 6 housing program, which was, getting rid of the big towers, the housing projects, which were concentrations of poverty, and spreading lower income people into mixed neighborhoods, which was supposed to be like the crown jewel of urban policy, could be responsible for this. And I think possibly it ties into what you were just saying. Does that have any validity here?
Jonathan, you're absolutely correct. It does. It does. That does have a mix in it. The mayor, of course, has torn down certain housing. It should have been kept up. It never was. For years, it's just been allowed to just become unlivable. But that's one problem. But Jonathan, that is not the problem that happened where we saw this horrific situation. Mm-hmm. That's something totally different. That we have more than one issue here. We have poverty and we have crime. Anywhere where you have a lot of poverty, you're going to have people doing things that are socially unacceptable. But this situation has happened as there was a great article in the Chicago Tribune where 3 of the reporters went out and actually talked to these young people. And that's what they told them. They said, listen, we don't have anything now. We don't need to share it with someone coming here in our neighborhood who are going right past the school they used to go to. What Duncan did in this 2010 and all of this changing these schools, the school in the area where the young man lived that was beaten to death, Jonathan, is now a military academy. And there are people who live right there who can't go to that school, and they said, okay, you have to go to Finger, which is 5 miles away. Now, in some instances, you are crossing gang lines, but in many others, when I was growing up, there wasn't a gang. There was a certain street. There was a different neighborhood. The mayor certainly knows about that. Mayor Daley lived in Bridgeport. If you went in Bridgeport, there were a lot of young people, and particularly African Americans, who were beaten and assaulted just because they crossed a certain geographical boundary.
Cliff,
so there's a mixture of both.
Very briefly, and then I'll wrap it up, Cliff, your message to Arne Duncan today when he visits Chicago.
My message to Arne Duncan is that he should try to undo what he created before he left. You know, a lot of people think he was the superintendent. He was not the superintendent. We don't have a superintendent of schools. We have a chief executive officer, which is what he was, and we have a chief educational officer, a woman who with a PhD in education. But let me say this. One thing they did try to do under the new gentleman who is now the chief executive officer, who was a former policeman, they attempted to identify hundreds of students who were at risk. In other words, the ones that they thought might fall prey to some gang activity. They finally identified them. I don't know how they did that, but then you know what they did? They gave the contract to work out whatever they're going to do to mitigate this unfortunate situation to some company in Pennsylvania. I don't understand that. I don't understand why they're not out at Finger, where all these things happen, or some of these other schools. But being downtown in some great hotel, I don't know how that's going to do anything to help.
I agree with you, Cliff. Thank you very much for sharing your analysis with us.